Good evening or good morning, wherever you happen to be in the world. I'm Gerry Wagoner from Ohio, and so it's about 2:15 here on the Eastern Time Zone in America. Today's topic is a very interesting topic. Over the last 10 years, I have been looking into paganism, where it came from, how it affected history, and how it is being revived in our culture today. So let's get into it. The title is Paganism in Today's Culture. In one way or another, this topic's going to affect every person who hears it. I'd like to open with a Bible story found in Daniel, the book of Daniel. And here we have the well-known story of Nebuchadnezzar. He was the monarch of the golden city of the golden era, Babylon. And one day he went out onto his balcony and he looked out over beautiful Babylon. And he said, "Wow, look at all this that I've done. Is this not great Babylon which I have built?" And God looked down from heaven and said, in essence, "Nebuchadnezzar, don't do that. People who are stuck on themselves, people who walk in pride, are in danger of losing their grip on sanity." And that's what happened to him. Judgment came upon him. He lost his mind for 7 years. And finally, at the end of that 7 year period of time, his reason came back to him. He recovered his mind. But more than that, he gained his heart. His closing words in Daniel chapter 4 are, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, worship and honor the God of heaven, all whose ways are righteous, and all who walk in pride, he is able to humble." Wow, what a story. I believe Nebuchadnezzar will be in the kingdom of heaven on that day when Jesus Christ comes back. But until then, that raises a question for you and I. What kind of a world are we living in today? Is it a pagan world or is it a Christian world? Nebuchadnezzar lived in a pagan world, Babylon. And here we are today in 2022. And the rising generation, which in America, as we call the millennial generation, is the first generation of our modern era to receive a fully developed neo-pagan cosmology masquerading as the correct view of history and demanding to be inscribed in public policy. Did you get all that? Kind of a mouthful, wasn't it? What does neo-pagan mean? It means new paganism, revived paganism. What is cosmology? Cosmology is how you and I look at the world, how we understand the world and our role in it. And so it is a well worked out cosmology or worldview about the nature of existence, and it is thoroughly pagan today. The culture in which you and I live, and millennials in which they were born, came from somewhere, friends. The culture that you live in Denmark or the culture that I live in America came from somewhere. It's not neutral. Our culture is being profoundly affected by anti-Christian notions passed off as truth. Now, for Christians generally, not just millennials, we need to know what that thinking is. Just to give you a flavor of the kind of thinking that has taken a hold of the Western world in recent years, let me cite a 1983 statement by Jeremy Rifkin, a guiding thinker in the European Union. This was 1983 now. I quote, "We no longer feel ourselves to be guests in someone else's home and therefore obliged to make our behavior conformed with a set of pre-existing cosmic rules. It is our creation now. We make the rules. We establish the parameters of reality. We create the world, and because we do, we no longer feel beholden to outside forces. We no longer have to justify our behavior For we are now the architects of the universe. We are responsible for nothing outside of ourselves. We are the kingdom, the power, the glory, forever and ever." Unquote. This man is an important thinker in the European Union since the year 2002, and I believe he accurately expresses how the present culture thinks. This is the world in which we are called as Christians to proclaim the everlasting gospel. The of this cosmology, which is a well worked out way of looking at things, has been developed over the last few decades, friends. Let's go back to 1993. That year, the magazine titled The Nation said this: "If the gay rights cause," and this was 29 years ago, by the way, "if the gay rights cause, a small and despised sexual minority, is to survive and eventually succeed, it will need to invent for itself a complete cosmology." It did, and it was a pagan cosmology. That statement was 29 years ago. All that has happened regarding sexuality in the last 29 years. We have watched in the recent period of our own history in America the development of this worldview. The success of this way of thinking is because the Christian cosmology has dissipated in the Western world. We have gone through a period where people no longer believe the Bible. They no longer believe that what we say is true. There's a long history of this, friends. For most of Western history, Christianity has dominated, but that's changing. God the Father was the fundamental notion of what was. And then we moved into an era of secular humanism. We had the attack of secular humanism, which brought about in its own way the decline of Christianity. And this is where man became God. The reason of man, encapsulated in the French Revolution, became the only source of truth. And that period lasted from about 1789 to 1989, for a period of 200 years, from the French Revolution to the fall of the wall in East Berlin. That 200-year period represents the high point of secular humanism, friends. And it's important that we as believers understand these long traditions because they affect the way we think. There are many people today, especially in universities at the professorial level, who still believe a strange thing happened. At the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, while these humanists with their hubris were predicting the end of religion, remember what Carl said, religion was the opiate of the people, and Carl Jung said it was a psychological disability from which you and I needed healing. In our time, oddly enough, we are seeing the decline of secular humanism. Really? Yeah. Hang in there. I will explain it as we go on. It is no longer, in a certain sense, the massive tool of the devil to attack Christian truth, because what is arising to replace it is a belief not in God the Father, but a belief in the return of the Divine Mother. Note that. That is to say, a rejection of this rationalism of the secular humanism to now an irrationalism based upon ancient pagan myths. Who on earth would have imagined that this proud, sophisticated Western culture, based on reason, would now be seduced by the pagan lie or the pagan myth? But I believe that's where we are today, friends. Many, many people are turning away from the so-called optimism of atheistic secular humanism, from pure materialism, and they are looking for spirituality somewhere. They are looking for God, but most of them don't know it. They heard the critique of postmodernism, which found that secular humanism was totally circular. For instance, Humanism believed that its reason was true, but it had no way of proving it except by assuming that its reason was true, which is circular reasoning. And so we see the embarrassing failure with the critique of postmodernism itself needing to make a rational statement that there is no such thing as a rational statement. In this worldview, there is no such thing as absolute truth. You see, we can't get out of this world that God has placed us, friends. We're in a world where we need to say true things. But those kind of effects produce the decline of atheistic secular humanism. And in its place, and I never expected to see this in my lifetime, when I grew up in America, I discovered a culture that was thoroughly Christian in the 1960s, especially in my cultural environment that I grew up, which is similar to Amish. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that at this very center of the Christian faith in America, which sent out missionaries to the very ends of the earth, never did I imagine that years later this country would become the toxic center of a pagan idea. It caused some shock in me as I grew up into the 80s and 90s. And I began reading some of the books of which I'll speak. I went through culture shock trying to figure out what had happened between 1960 when I was born and 1990 when we made a trip to Europe. Now, America is still a very religious culture, but it was changing religion. And the religion that I believe is now at the basis of what I call pagan cosmology is pagan romanticism, or the worship of nature. That's the new religion of our culture. And there's a whole chapter in this history where I tried to put my finger on one important influence after another, and I kept repeatedly coming back to the name of Carl Jung, spelled Jung. He was a very notable figure in history. At the beginning of the 20th century, he, along with Sigmund Freud, were the fathers of psychology. And I believe Carl Jung succeeded because he believed in spirituality, albeit the wrong kind. We know now that he had a demon guide which would speak to him. He was very critical of secular humanism, Carl Jung was, and he wanted a place for spirituality, but not the spirituality of the Bible, even though he was the son of a Lutheran pastor. He had this vision in the beginning of the 20th century of a new human, and it was based on pagan myths. He was an expert, you see, on alchemy, Gnosticism, Hinduism, and his goal was to eliminate from the West the very notion of guilt. In his worldview, guilt was the problem, or the many problems in our culture. Well, guilt has a place in your life and mine, friends. There are two kinds, by the way. There's false guilt and genuine guilt. False guilt is when someone else is trying to control us by making us feel guilty, get us to do what they want us to do. Genuine guilt is when we have transgressed God's laws or his ways in the Bible, and that is a legitimate expression of guilt. However, Carl Jung wanted to do away with all guilt whatsoever, even the good kind. And he realized that in these pagan myths and in the Eastern world, there was no such thing as guilt in the Eastern pagan myths. The reason is that in these pagan systems, you are able to see the opposites that conflict and you can join them together yourself. You create a total relativism of good and evil where you bring what you think is good and evil and you join them together. In other words, you transcend them. In other words, you're kind of a god. And so he called on people to develop their sense of the unconscious and their fantasies. Does this sound modern to you? Oh, yeah. Have you ever heard of the movie or book 50 Shades of Grey? That's an outgrowth of this kind of thinking. The fantasies that we now accept as truth, for instance, where a man with hairy arms who's 6'4" can use a woman's bathroom because he is convinced that he's a woman. I tell you, We are now in the world of fantasy, friends. We have left the very solid notions of a biblical world. And of course, all that is surrounded by the enticing notions of pagan spirituality and mysticism of the paranormal world. Carl Jung was involved in the occult. I mentioned that he had two spirit guides named Philemon and Ka. He proposed liberation for human beings on the basis of the liberation of spirituality through paganism and through free sex. Remember that. Now, you may question if my description of Carl Jung is correct. It is. And I was fascinated some years ago to find a biographer of this important figure of Carl Jung, a secular Harvard researcher by the name of Richard Knoll, who produced two books on Carl Jung. As an intellectual, he tried to place Jung in the whole of Western culture. In the foreword of his second book, he says that he looked around to find a figure of equal importance to Carl Jung in history, and the only one he could find was Julian the Apostate. Julian the Apostate, the Roman leader, who in AD 350, he was the nephew of Constantine, by the way. He was raised in a Christian home, but when he became emperor, he tried to turn the nation of Rome back to the worship of Isis, the goddess of magic and the goddess of the underworld, and the worship of nature. He failed in a sense because the Roman Church was in ascendancy at that time, and even though it had adopted multiple pagan influences, it projected a facade of Christianity. It is said that on his deathbed, and by him I mean Julian the Apostate, he uttered these words: "You have conquered, Galilean." He couldn't beat Jesus. Wow. And so this man, Richard Knoll, says we need to compare Carl Jung with the Apostate because Jung succeeded where Julian the Apostate failed. Oh, really? What did Julian try to do? Remember, he tried to turn the Roman Empire back into overt paganism. According to this Harvard author, Carl Jung succeeded in doing that in Western civilization. He says the patriarchal monotheism of Orthodox Judeo-Christian faith has all but collapsed. In filling the void, we find Protestants, Catholics, Jews, Muslims adopting alternate syncretistic belief systems that belie a basis in Jungian psychological theories. Carl Jung. Let's go back a few years or forward, depending on where your starting point is. In 1967, there was a movement called the Death of God sweeping through colleges and universities. I was 7 years old during year. Some of you may remember this period of time where this notion that God was dead became very, very popular. And as we studied these theologians who talked about the death of God in that era, in other words, that man no longer needed God anymore, he had come of age, we interpreted this as the success of secular humanism. And we saw the withering away of Christianity throughout that decade and the ones that followed. From then on, there would be less and less spirituality in Western culture because why? Because of the death of God. But one of these theologians by the name of David Miller wrote a book in 1974, 7 years later, called The New Polytheism. Here's what he said. The death of God, actually the death of God of the Bible, I quote, "The death of God freed the West of the tyrannical imperialism of monotheism." In other words, that there is one God, one creator, who is worthy of our praise and worship. And then he said, at the death of God, we will see the rebirth of the gods and goddesses of ancient Greece and Rome, unquote. Well, isn't that amazing? In 1974, this man was mapping out the future. The reason why he knew the future was why? I would suggest because he was a scholar of Carl Jung, he was a disciple of Carl Jung, and he realized the power of Carl Jung's interpretation of the whole of psychology to get us in touch with inner gods. Human enlightenment. When I was a young man growing up in America, I never thought that America would ever be called Hindu. But I've been seeing books in the last 10 years that make a very strong case that this has become a reality. Philip Goldberg, American Veda, from Emerson and the Beatles to yoga and meditation, How Indian Spirituality Changed the West, that's a long title, a book that appeared in 2009, by the way, recognizes how Eastern and how Hindu we have become. Newsweek magazine stated a few years back, we are all Hindus now. As we use all these Eastern terms like mantra and practice yoga. Not long ago, there was a member of our church claimed to have holy yoga classes. In California, the church in Encinitas, California, was teaching yoga to their students. It has permeated widely throughout Western culture. Now, in 1977, a book was published by a psychologist named June Singer. June Singer. The title of her book was Androgyny, The Opposites Within. Now, she was a personal friend of Carl Jung. She was at his bedside as he died. And she wrote this book calling for a new view of sexuality, namely the joining of the two genders of male and female, which is what androgyny is, isn't it? Sure. It's a hybrid of male and female. In this book, she seeks to push forward Carl Jung's vision of a new humanism, and here is what she said, and I quote, "What lies in store as we move towards the longed-for conjunction of the opposites? That's the bringing together of all these different categories into one. The question is, can the human psyche realize its own creative potential through building its own cosmology and supplying it with its own gods?" Unquote. Are you hearing a recurring theme in these authors and thinkers? There you have it. You see, immediately these new pagans wanted to develop not just a personal experience through meditation and individual enlightenment, but they wanted to develop a whole new worldview that could be applied to the entire culture. What we are seeing, friend, is a spiritual revival in reverse. It's a pagan revival. You see, these things are fundamentally anti-Christian notions, understand that. But this is the world in which we are called upon to preach the everlasting gospel in our day, 2022. You may wonder if what I'm saying is really the case, and how much is this really affecting us? Well, I happen to know that this kind of worldview, this cosmology and vision has reached very high places of power. A few examples. In the 90s, Gene Houston was the spiritual counselor and channeler, notice the word, for Hillary Clinton to get in touch with the spirit of Eleanor Roosevelt. It was in the mid to late 90s. During that period of time, Gene Houston produced a book. The very same time that she was in the corridors of the White House of America. She came out with this book titled The Passion of Isis and Osiris, A Gateway to Transcendent Love. This is a pagan worldview, friends. And so, in a certain sense, you could say that Carl Jung succeeded where Julian the Apostate failed in turning the world back into a pagan cosmology. Friends, we are in the presence of a cosmology or worldview that is committed to the destruction of the Christian worldview by supposedly proposing something that is superior to Christianity. It is all embracing. What is its good news? If it's a religion, it must have some good news. What is its good news? It claims to be able to join the opposites to create a new pagan cosmology. And so, as you look at this kaleidoscope of all these different religions around the world, friend, I'd like to sum it up and just be simple. There are only two religions. I am concurring rather happily with Sean Boonstra, an acquaintance of mine who said something very similar recently. There are only two religions. I find that to be true. I have a simple mind, and I find that lots of other people do as well. So we get along just fine. There are only two religions. I would argue that there's a religion of one and the religion of two, based on biblical distinctions. In the first, the religion of one, there are no real distinctions. You see, everything is made of the same stuff. Matter is eternal. It has the spark of divinity within it, so we can worship it. We justify pantheistic worship. And so that's the basis of nature worship, friends, which the world is rife with in its fervor for climate change and control over your life through the environment. There's no category for sin in this worldview. Why? Because everything is within the circle: trees, rocks, good and evil, man, God, limestone, elm trees. Everything is one. And so in that circle, we can do whatever we want to. We can do whatever we feel like doing regarding gender and marriage. We have a tolerance for all religions, all beliefs, all lifestyles, and all sexuality. Sound familiar? It should. That's our culture today. But there's another kind of religion, which is the true kind. And that is biblical religion. In this worldview, we have the wisdom of God based on his being totally separate from the things that he made. That's the message of the Bible, friends. From the very first statement in the Bible, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Everything else in the Bible from that stage on is pure commentary, as C.S. Lewis once said. God is a God of distinctions. There are distinctions between male and female, wholesome, healthy distinctions designed for our flourishing and safety. Distinction between creator and creation. Distinctions between good and evil, symbolized by a tree in the Garden of Eden. Distinctions even between land and sea, and distinctions between the seventh day and the other 6 days of the week. You'll find that all in the very first chapters of the Bible. Now, when we say that God created nature, while that does bring God and nature into relation, it also separates them. You see, who makes it and what is made are separate. They are two and not one. They are separate. God is the God of distinctions. Neopaganism is the religion of joining the opposites of all things one. You might wonder what happened to the term New Age. It was a popular term back in the 70s, even 60s through the 90s. Well, the New Age has gone mainstream, friends. It went mainline, that's all. Nobody uses the term anymore. Why? Because now it's gone mainline. Because now people say, I'm spiritual, but not religious. Have you ever heard that? Oh, yeah, I have. It's the mantra. It is the battle cry of a new pagan religion that has taken over West culture. The current terms, by the way, that have replaced New Age movement are integral or progressive spirituality. The joining of the opposites is a fundamental plank in the pagan worldview. Crucial to this worldview is sexuality. Sexuality. Let's talk about that for a moment. Unless you've been living under a rock or in a cave somewhere, we have seen in the Western world's adoption of alternative sexuality this neo-paganism played out in technicolor. And it's happening right, friends. Huge moral shifts that used to occur in a century or two are now occurring in the space of 7 to 10 years. Let me give you an example. In the last decade, in a period of no more than 7 years, a majority of American people went from believing that same-sex marriage should not be legalized to a majority believing that same-sex marriage must be legalized. 2011 to the fall of 2018. 7 years' time. With a rising tide of moral lawlessness, I credit social media as a big factor in the accelerating velocity of this hyper-cultural change. Huge changes that used to take decades, maybe even a century, are now happening in a very short period of time. And you notice today that acceptance of this new worldview is demanded. It's not suggested or recommended, it is now demanded. No other viewpoint is allowed. In America, we call that cancel culture. And I'm sure you have your own versions in whatever country you're in, friend. You notice that recently there's no debate on some of these sexual issues anymore. We are being silenced, friends. Just as we were silenced during the COVID pandemic, when people began to ask questions and sought informed decisions so they could consent or not consent to a vaccine that was being pressured and forced upon them. They were being silenced. No alternative viewpoint was allowed. This is a deliberate rationalization of something that God does not accept, friends. Coercion is a quality of the enemy, not from God. This new religion is animated by a lively sense of self-righteousness and outrage. You've seen that. You can see it on Twitter as outrage mobs would come pouring in on anyone who dared to transgress the popular narrative in culture. Any dissent was titled hate speech, since the necessity for self-justification requires the complicity of the whole culture. Wow. Holdouts, in other words, people who disagreed, could not be tolerated because they are a potential rebuke to the pagan lie. You see, friends, behind this gay agenda is not simply just giving rights to a few people and then they'll go away and be happy. No, it is actually an entire reconstruction of the way we think about our existence in life. You could tell that if you knew about the statement of the Gay Liberation Manifesto from 1972, which says, this is 1972 now, equality is never going to be enough. Yeah. From Dorothy Riddle's Riddle scale in the 1990s to the cancel culture mobs of social media nowadays, equality is not enough. Conformity and compliance alone is what they seek. Your voice must be silenced if you disagree. And for them, what is needed is a total social revolution, a complete reordering of civilization, including society's most basic institution. What is that? The patriarchal family. One of my favorite books is titled Patriarchs and Prophets. My wife and I have gained so many insights from that book. I recommend it to all of you, even though the title may become increasingly unpopular and unpolitically correct. I recommend it in clear conscience. Patriarchs and Prophets. Now, I would argue that the gay agenda is merely the tip of the spear of an ideology that wants to reinvent the notion of objective biblical truth. They want to change your life and mine into subjective visions of truth, not objective truth, objective because it came from outside of us, but subjective. Because for them, truth is an internal construct, different in every person because no two people are alike. Well, that's not truth, friend. That's a false truth. Genuine truth is objective, external, absolute truth. Let me sum all this up. We have to understand not only our own theology, but the ideology of the world around us, friends. And that's why we're interested in culture. It's why I am an observer in culture. I believe we need to be aware of what the culture is saying in order to speak truth to it, in order to encourage and help some people who are enslaved by these ideas. These new neo-pagan writers and thinkers believe that the human mind is limited by secular humanism and needed to be broken open to receive the intelligence of the spirit world. Wow. Back in the 1970s, we thought secular humanism was the great enemy of Christianity, and it was. Through it, we saw the withering away of Christianity. But, friends, let me tell you this: secular humanism is on the run. Secular humanism is on the run. It's being chased away. It has been broken open to receive the intelligence of the spirit world. But what spirit? Good question. You see, for many years, secular humanism would not consider this type of spirituality. No. But now they are buying into it. They don't find it primitive anymore, friends. Today, the culture is calling for an intimate relationship with nature and the larger cosmos by the mediation of spirits. But again, what spirits? For them, the cosmic creation force is female. We'll come back to that later. The idea is that the center of God's creation has produced a cosmological estrangement for these secular humanists turned neo-pagan. They reject every biblical distinction and notion. And so scientific atheism and New Age pantheism are destined to come together and form a powerful opposition to Christianity in the time of the end. Children today are the first generation in 500 years, friends, to have grown up in an almost entirely pagan meta-narrative. In other words, they've been surrounded with these influences from birth on up. They are facing neo-pagan challenges that have not been seen in the West since the time of the Reformation. That's why I used 500 years. Be patient with them, friends. Our children are growing up in a world different from the one you and I grew up in. We can afford to be patient with them. And we must find our voice with this generation. We must find the mind of Christ with this generation. We must reach out to them and care for them. A lot of them believe that they're bad people. They don't know why. And so, as we attempt to sum this up, we are told in the book of Revelation in the Bible, chapter 13, for one, that the end time power has two striking characteristics. What are they? Number one, the end time dominant power in the world is coercive. It seeks to force and compel you against your will. Number two, it also desires worship. We are told that apostate Christianity will play a major role in the end of time, friends. And some of the elements of this new apostate Christianity or paganism are as follows. I will read through 5 of them. And I think you'll be surprised later where these show elsewhere in our culture. Number 1 is radical environmentalism, where Mother Earth is worshipped and regarded as some sort of deity. Now, back during the industrial age, Mother Earth, or the Earth, I should say, where all of us live, was regarded as an inert object, simply to be used for human purposes. Today, that view has been abandoned, and now the Earth is being invested with some sort of deity. Feminism, the next story. Feminism opened the door. It undermined biblical dualism. It threw the first bomb at God's distinctions in the Bible, which was between male and female, in the first creational chapters of the Bible. And from that point on, biblical dualism or biblical distinctions began to be undermined at an alarming pace. Feminism, where the sacred feminine is united with spirituality in the natural world, there's a word for that. It's called Gaia. It is the Mother Earth goddess of the environment. The rise of the neo-pagan sacred feminine in our culture, for instance, has helped influence and motivate the clamor for the ordination of women, even in the Christian church. It is helpful for us to understand where these things are coming from. The third category is LGBTQ. Western culture has built an idol to homosexuality, friends. You know this. You've seen it. So have I. And now Western culture is commanding and demanding that you and I fall down and worship that idol or face increasing social, financial, and cultural marginalization. You will bow down and worship that idol, or you will face increasingly social, financial, and cultural marginalization. In other words, you'll be made to pay a price. Number 4, abortion. That's a hot topic now in America with the leaked draft of the Supreme Court, which appears to be headed towards upholding the sanctity of life or doing away with a federal blanket mandate for abortion and throwing it back to the 50 states of America and letting them decide, which is probably the right thing to do. As a Christian, with a Christian worldview, I believe life is sacred and no one has the right to kill a child in the womb, friends. Save the trees and abort the babies is the mantra of our pagan culture. Number 5. Notice the wholesale condemnation of white people in Western culture, particularly in America, as if they, and we, as I'm one of them, are to blame for all of society's ills. You see, we first saw this in the 1930s Germany regarding Jewish people, friends, and this is a profoundly ungodly approach to life. If I can blame all of my problems on someone else, then I can avoid facing my own problems. That is the goal of this cultural racism, or wokeness as we call it in America. All 5 of these show up in something here in America called social justice ideology. All 5 of these are subtext or platforms of social justice ideology, which doesn't create the problems according to its own worldview, but presents itself as the solution to problems that are created by cultural Marxism and neo-paganism. Now I have a question for you. I mentioned apostate Christianity. What is that? What is apostate? It is quite simply those who have turned from good to bad. They have repented from good to evil, so to speak. In this setting, they are no longer Christians, but an amalgamation of paganism, social justice, and cultural Marxism. Let me repeat. What is apostate? It is those who have turned from good to evil. In the Christian setting, they are no longer Christians, but rather a combination of paganism, social justice, and cultural Marxism. We are seeing a spiritual revival in reverse, friends. Well, what has happened in my lifetime and many of yours, is a radical, catastrophic religious change from a biblical civilization with all of its problems, and we have some, to a militant neo-pagan civilization. That's where we are today, friends. In my lifetime, we have seen Western culture go from a Christian to a pagan culture. I believe we are facing an ideological leviathan, thoroughly worked out pagan cosmology, and it's in that context, friends, that we need to speak the gospel or the good news of the Bible. How do we do that? Ancient Rome believes that God is a part of nature. The modern day radical environmentalist movement shares that belief, friends. Christianity believes that God is excellent and that religion doesn't change. It may develop, but it has fundamental notions that give humanity all the truth that we need to be human beings created in the image of God. So what do we do? All I can tell you is my hope and prayer. My hope and prayer. I believe the only answer to a self-justifying, rationalizing, all-inclusive cosmology based on the lie of all things being one is a robust, convincing, courageous cosmology or worldview of biblical truth. That was a mouthful, wasn't it? But only a discourse at this level will save the millennial generation, friends, and us well. You see, we are Christ's church on earth, those of us who are Christians. Read the Bible, friends. It's quite simple. Read it and hang on to its words. In those words, you will find answers for every problem that you and I struggle with. I am amazed at how accurate the Bible is to provide those answers to every problem that I face. I am amazed how sin binds and destroys a person. And I am amazed how repentance and cleansing can free a person. And I'm amazed how God can change someone's life. The Bible is full of life, friends. It is full of truth, peace, and joy. And as the psalmist says, I believe in Psalm 67, verse 7, one day all the ends of the earth will fear him. Who's him? The Creator, God of heaven. And by fear, it means to hold him in awe and respect that he deserves. The final testimony of Nebuchadnezzar that I quoted earlier. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and honor and extol the God of heaven, all whose ways are righteous, and those who walk in pride he is able to abase. I believe that statement, that testimony will be taken up on the lips of all pagan rulers and nations, past and present, friends. Some of them willingly, as they humble themselves and convert to the everlasting truth of the gospel, and some will make that statement in the great anguish and pain as the divine judgment falls upon them. Thank you, and God bless you.